in that Q&A for Fred to address. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Mr. Fred Fuchs. Go ahead, Fred.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us. I also want to give a special thanks to any of you who happen to have attended our Valentine's Day event, the screening of The Big Sleep. Over 125 people bought tickets, and even more remarkable, we received another $8,000 in donations last week. And as you know, we're a nonprofit charitable organization, shut down, no revenue. So those donations are just so important for us. And even if it's only $10, it really helps to show some of our funders and grant writers that we really have a community that is still supporting us. It's kind of sad. This is the last of our film noir series. It's really been great fun. It's, as you know, one of my favorite genres. Actually, we got to do 6 because The Big Sleep was kind of a film noir as well. And certainly we saved one of the greatest ever, The Third Man for the last. And as Jeffrey said, at the end of this, we're going to tell you about our next series, which starts next Monday. So now, we've really only been talking about American films and American film noir movies, but film noir movies were made all over the world, not just in America. And particularly France, there were a number of great film noir movies made there. Pepe Le Moko, and any number of great ones, and also ones in the UK as well. And of course, tonight's film was not made in America. It is a UK film, financed mostly in the UK, directed by, of course, the great Carol Reed, a UK director. And this is really quite different because, most of the American ones were sort of based on pulp fiction stories or novels, as we've talked about. And this one was not. This one was, of course, based on an original screenplay by the great novelist, Graham Greene. And maybe that's part of the reason, at least for me, this film still feels perhaps a little more contemporary or a little less dated, perhaps, than some of the other films we've seen before. But I'll be curious to hear your thoughts about that, and if you've noticed a difference from some of the American film noirs. Now, this, of course, is one of the best-loved movies of all time. In fact, in many British polls, it's considered the greatest British film ever made, which is kind of an extraordinary thing to say. And I love the quote from the great critic Roger Ebert, who said, "Of all the movies I've ever seen, this one completely embodies the romance of going to the movies." Now, unfortunately, we didn't go to the movies to watch it. Maybe one day we will, but it certainly is something I relate to and agree with Roger about. And it's interesting to look at this film in the perspective of the World War II and certainly what was going on also in the film industry. And it's hard to believe because, of course, Casablanca was 1943, so that was only 5 years before. And I feel like there's some parallels here. It's sort of, the exhausted aftermath of World War II, brings us to The Third Man. We're no longer in this world of Casablanca and romance and happy endings, but there are similarities, right? So both have heroes who are American exiles, and they're in a world of treachery and black market intrigue, and they both fall in love with a woman battered by the war. And Casablanca, of course, though, is always, the hope of victory. While with The Third Man, we're already starting to see the beginning of the Cold War years of paranoia and betrayal and the bomb. The hero doesn't get the girl, right? So, this is really kind of interesting perspective on what happened and where people's minds were at. And certainly, Harry Lime saved Anna, who was a displaced person, who faced certain death. But of course, Holly, will never understand what Anna did to survive the war. And Anna has no desire to tell him. So really, it is a story, kind of an existential story, like many of Graham Greene's novels, of loss and betrayal. It's that sort of weary, knowing feeling. And its whole presentation, its style, sort of an act of defiance against this corrupt world it pictured. Of course, one of the most extraordinary parts of this film is the atmospheric use of the black and white, expressionist photography. Robert Krasker was the cinematographer, and sort of that harsh lighting and many of the things we've talked about in the other film noirs. And of course, perhaps more than any other film, the distorted Dutch angle camera technique. And by the way, I made an error when I described the word Dutch angle coming from Deutsch angle or German expressionism. That's not where Dutch angle actually came from. I did some more research, and it really came from after the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century. The English came up with a bunch of word combinations. They had expressions like Dutch wife. You may have heard that, which is a sex doll or prostitute. Dutch courage, boldness when you're drunk. Double Dutch, which is gibberish. Dutch leave, defecting, and a Dutch treat when, refers to, when each person pays for themselves. So these were all expressions that actually came out of this conflict with the Dutch back in the 17th century. And of course, a Dutch tilt or a Dutch angle refers to the fact that it's a non-traditional, non-aligned frame. So very interesting, but not actually what I had originally thought. So, and then of course, where does that third man title come from? Because there's lots of different answers to that. But one of the things that seemed interesting to me, or one definition, is that it's a logical paradox in which the attempt to pass from one thing to another, or to relate one concept to another, reveals the necessity of a third, an intervening thing or conception, and hence leads to an infinite regress. Very interesting. Other references to the third man, other thoughts you might have about where that title came from, I'd love to hear. Now, for me, this film is really all about Graham Greene, who's one of my favorite novelists of all time. And his literary acclaim and popularity was absolutely tremendous at this time. And he wrote two kinds of novels. He wrote very serious kind of Catholic novels. He was a Catholic, The Power and the Glory, and some very serious. In fact, he was shortlisted twice for Nobel Prize for Literature. But he also liked to write what he called entertainments. And the third man falls into that category of entertainments, although, as I said, it's not a novel. It was original as a screenplay. And in fact, it was the only one Graham Greene wrote, even though there are many, many films that were based on his books. He started actually as a film critic, right after the war. And in fact, during the war, he actually worked for British intelligence, a little like Jean le Carré, David Cornwall. And he, in fact, worked with the famous Soviet agent, Kim Philby. And Kim Philby, of course, is the traitor who, ultimately went, and went to the Soviet Union. In fact, he was often referred to as the third man by the British press after he was exposed, because there were the Cambridge Five, who all were Soviet traitors. And in fact, he was the third that actually revealed. So there's some thought that some aspects of Harry Lime is actually based on that character. And in the original screenplay, of course, Harry Lime is British. He's not an American. And I'll explain how that change happened later. Some of his other entertainment works, if you don't know them, The Confidential Agent, The Quiet American, Our Man in Havana, The Human Factor, all were made into movies as well. And Greene really had this avid interest in the workings and intrigues of international politics and espionage. He was a very unusual kind of writer because he wrote, longhand with a black fountain pen. In fact, Michael Korda, the famous writer and editor and publisher, who is a nephew of Alexander Korda, the producer of the film, noted that he would, they would sit each morning. He would write about 500 words in his little small black leather notebook. And that was his daily penance or, routine. And then he'd put the notebook away, and that was it for the rest of the day. It's very interesting to me, always have writers work, and they're very disciplined, and they're very different approach. So although this was an entertainment, it certainly does speak very much to the issues of good and evil, men in flight and pursuit, men who, as Robert Browning called it, live on the dangerous edge of things. That was one of Greene's favorite quotes. But this is a movie, to which many contribute. And of course, it's just grown richer and richer over the passing years. So it all began really in around 1948. And it was sort of the brainchild of Sir Alexander Korda. Now, Sir Alexander Korda was the most successful British producer of the time. He was Hungarian, a Jewish Hungarian who had emigrated to England. He had a brief dalliance with Los Angeles, but came back to England and made many successful films. And he had just finished doing a film a year or two before called The Fallen Idol. And that was the first time that the director, Carol Reed, who also directed this film, and Graham Greene first met, because that movie was based on a short story by Graham Greene called The Basement Room. And The Fallen Idol is a fantastic movie, a mystery thriller film. And if you hadn't seen it, I would highly recommend it. And in fact, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay, and won a BAFTA for Best British Film. So once the film was completed, Korda tasked Greene with the idea of doing research and writing an original post-war continental story to be based on either one of the following territories: Vienna or Rome. And Reed was already set as the director. So they sent Greene off to post-World War II Vienna, which in 1947, 48 was an absolutely extraordinary place because it was divided into 4 Allied zones. It was very much like Berlin. There was the French zone, the American zone, the English zone, and the Soviet zone. And of course, Reconstruction hadn't happened. It was bombed out, and you can certainly see the incredible locations that they used in the filming. And it was quite extraordinary because this was a film that was shot, quite a bit of it, on location, and that was simply not done at that time. There were people, especially in Britain, there weren't location films being shot this way. They were starting to do it in Italy, some of the Rossellini movies, and they were doing it a few other places, but this was really one of the first ones that was done on location. But the narrative actually came from some notes that Greene had written almost 20 years earlier. And it was just a line he had written, which was, "I paid my last farewell to Harry a week ago, when the coffin was lowered into the frozen February ground. And so it was with incredulity that I saw him pass by without a sign of a recognition among the host of strangers in the Strand," which of course is in London. At the time, Graham Greene did not know he was going to be, setting a film in Vienna, but he had this kind of concept. So while writing the screenplay, Graham started by writing a story or a novella. He wasn't really an experienced screenwriter. And although the novella was then going to be the source text for the screenplay and was never meant to be published or read by anybody, later on did get published and became, quite, well known as a novel itself. But in 1948 in Vienna, he toured the sewers, the nightclubs. He met some correspondents. He learned about the black market, and really came up with many of the plot ideas that we see today. And then, of course, the original narrator in the novella is Major Calloway, and with slightly different emphasis, from that in the screenplay. There was some changes between the novella and the screenplay, but one of the biggest changes, of course, is that Holly Martin and Harry Lime were English in the book and in the screenplay, and it was only much later that they became Americans. Another very interesting part of the location shooting was they used a lot of real local people as extras, right? And it really tried to capture some of that neo-realistic style, as I mentioned, that Visconti and Rossellini were making popular at that time. And in fact, you may have noticed there's an incredible scene where the streets are often wet and often at night, and you could actually see in the background of the shots the local Viennese fire department watering down the streets. And these weren't extras. This was actually just done as sort of part of the creating the whole film. Now, when it came to actually getting it financed, Alexander Korda had to turn to his co-producer, a very famous American named David Selznick. And David Selznick, of course, is one of the greatest producers of all time in America and Hollywood. In fact, he was married to Louis B. Mayer's daughter. So the expression for Selznick was "the son-in-law also rises." And he made many great films. A Star is Born, Nothing Sacred, Made for Each Other. But of course, his most famous film is Gone with the Wind, which was in 1939 and won 8 Oscars. And it still remains the highest grossing film of all time if you relate to inflation. And he also brought over Alfred Hitchcock to produce Rebecca. And that was the first Hollywood movie of Alfred Hitchcock, and that won a Best Picture and was the only Hitchcock film that won Best Picture. But Selznick's big contribution was really bringing American distribution, bringing money, and most important, changing these 2 leads to Americans and bringing Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles, and of course, Alida Valli. Now, Joseph Cotten and Valli were both under contract to Selznick, so it was not just a coincidence that he wanted them to be part of the film. His other big contribution was that he was an amphetamine user and was well known for his long rambling memos, etc. And he introduced the Third Man director, Carol Reed, to the use of amphetamines, which allowed Reed to bring the picture in below budget. He actually shot it, he would work 22 hours a day. He was sometimes shooting with 4 different units, a daytime unit, a nighttime unit, a sewer unit. It's just sort of a strange behind the scene thing, but no human being obviously would be able to do that probably without some kind of drugs assisting him. And that was David O. Selznick's contribution. And Reed, was very happy with the idea of casting Orson Welles. Originally, there was a lot of conversation about Noel Coward playing the role, and many different actors were considered, as often happens, during the casting. And of course, Orson Welles at this point was a little bit sort of a box office poison, and he ultimately made the decision to just take the cash instead of having a back end in the film. And I think that was, ultimately, I think he was very disappointed he decided not to take the back end, since the movie made a lot of money. And he just thought he was shooting for a week and, it wasn't a big deal or anything else. Now, Carol Reed, interestingly, worked with the British Army's wartime documentary unit. So if you look and see some of the more documentary-like qualities to this film, it's not a surprise. And he was very familiar with the devastation of Europe. He had experienced it firsthand. He really, knew this world that he was creating in this film. Kasker, we've talked about the wide-angle lenses, the bizarre lighting. Absolutely extraordinary, and we're going to show you some shots from the film, as we always do, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But it was really this matching this, this city and story, and I can't think of any other film where the location of the film is such a critical part of the whole movie. Of course, the emotional heart is, Holly's Joseph Cotten's character's infatuation with Anna. And she grows to be affectionate with Harry and grateful to him for what she learns. But there's so many interesting little details to the scenes that they have in their apartment and everything else. And in fact, sometimes she doesn't call him Holly, she calls him Harry by mistake. But anyway, you know, it's their relationship, I think, is quite interesting. So now another incredible part of this movie, of course, is the music, right? So the music was, you know, well, Reed always wanted to do something unusual with the music of this film. He didn't think it would be like, you know, it was appropriate to just have your traditional kind of Hollywood score. And it was almost by accident, because he was in a club in Vienna and he heard this musician, Anton Karas, writing, you know, performing on his zither, this very unusual instrument, right? And he just loved the sound of it, and he decided he was going to make this instrument and this, you know, Karas, the composer, and create the score. And not only, I think, you know, did it work very well, but this the title music, the Third Man theme, actually topped the international music charts in 1950. And this guy Karas became quite famous. And there are many people who think this is one of the greatest, you know, film scores of all time. And in fact, it's been borrowed by even famous composers like Nino Rota. And it's the principal melody in La Dolce Vita. So, and it was really almost accidental, you know, that Reed met this guy and came up with this brilliant idea. But that's really often what happens in film, is that, you know, the greatest inspirations are not ones that are necessarily all planned out in advance, but kind of happen as the movie's being made, as it's being prepared. And it's the great directors who recognize this situation and then, you know, and then take advantage of it. And if you really think about it, and we'll show some shots later, how the strings of the zither, which you see at the very beginning of the film, are often reflected later on throughout the movie. Now, the cast, you know, it's hard to imagine this movie without Orson Welles in this iconic role, even though, of course, he doesn't even appear until halfway through the movie. And I don't think he's actually on film for more than 7 minutes or something like that. And in fact, often some of the wide shots are not even him. There's a second unit person. Hard to imagine Joseph Cotten not in the role. But Carol Reed's original choice, when he knew he was going to have to make it American, was Jimmy Stewart. And it was only because Selznick had Joseph Cotten under contract that Cotten got used. And of course, you know, there was an irony that Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten, of course, had, you know, worked together back in the radio days, Citizen Kane, the Magnificent Ambersons, etc. So Cary Grant had also been considered at the time, but we wound up with this wonderful cast. Robert Mitchum was being considered for the part, but he was having some problems with his drug abuse. Anyhow, this is where we wound up. And then, of course, Alida Valli, not Anna Valli, sorry, Anna's the name of the character, but Alida Valli, who was also under contract to Selznick at the time. Now, she's a very interesting woman. In fact, she's credited as Valli. You know, she was such a huge star in Europe at the time. It was almost like Garbo or something. Her actual name was Baroness Alida Maria Laura Altenberger von Mackenstein Frohlenberger. She really was a baroness, an Italian actress. She appeared in over 100 movies, a huge, huge star in Europe. And Selznick, of course, in fact, in her early 20s, she was considered the most beautiful woman in the world. And Selznick thought he could do, you know, what he had done with Ingrid Bergman and bring her to Hollywood and make English language films. And it was not a complete success. There were 1 or 2 other films that did okay, but this, of course, being the greatest English language film she ever appeared in. You know, again, with Orson Welles, there are lots of stories about him, influencing the director, Carol Reed, and making up his own dialogue. You know, I'm not sure any of that is actually so true, but I think it is true if you think about the look of the third man, it really wouldn't have happened without Welles's work on Citizen Kane, and The Stranger. And these are movies, of course, Carol Reed knew well, and I'm sure was being influenced. And many of even the editorial style and the deep focus shots and all those kinds of things really did come from Welles. Of course, there's the famous entrance we'll talk about, and that speech. Trevor Howard, as Major Calloway, was not a well-known English actor at the time. In fact, he had just been introduced into cinema in 1945 in a great film called Brief Encounter that David Lean directed. And of course, he went on to quite a successful career. And he did star in this movie with huge international success. And he went on actually to appear in many Graham Greene movies based on Graham Greene novels after that. And there's a very funny story about it, because when they were filming in Vienna, Howard was rushing to the bar for a drink as soon as the film finished, and he was in too big a hurry to change out of his uniform. So after a few drinks, he got into an argument, and he wound up getting detained because he was, for impersonating a British officer, and a whole crazy world that must have been. I can't even imagine. The most significant change, of course, was the ending, and again, in the ending of the novella, in the ending of the original script, Anna and Holly are about to begin a new life together at the end. It describes them, striding along together. He catches up with her. She puts her hand through his arm. And, this was, what people wanted, including Graham Greene, thought that this happy ending of the novel was appropriate for the film. But it was Carol Reed, with the support of David Selznick, who stubbornly refused to end the film with this, what they thought, artificially happy note. And this was one of the few big disputes between Carol Reed and Graham Greene. And later, of course, he said, this was a big dispute concerning the ending, and he has proved triumphantly right. So it was shot in 6 weeks, the fall of 1948. They were rushing to finish before the snow. Then they moved back to London and did some additional shooting in the studio, especially some of the shots in the sewer. Orson Welles was not a big fan of going into the Vienna sewers. A lot of his close-ups were shot later, and a body double was used in those wide shots in the sewer. And so the resulting footage is said to be about 85% Vienna and 15% London. And in fact, if you remember the very famous shot of Harry Limes trying to escape through the sewers, and we see his fingers, trying to, you see them coming up through a grate in the sewer, that wasn't Orson Welles. In fact, the hands in that shot were actually the director, Carol Reed's hands. So, that's what happens. Of course, there's that famous scene at the Ferris wheel. And that was an inspiration that Graham Greene had when, of course, he first toured Vienna and saw these various locations, and then of course so many great moments, so many great locations in this scene. The very last shot again is kind of extraordinary. As you remember, we see Holly, with and watching Anna walking on the roadside. And she walks right towards him and past him, but never looking at him. And then ultimately we see her, sort of walking away. And everyone thought the scene was kind of over, but Reed kept the camera running. And it's a very unusual long shot and absolutely perfect for ending of the film. So what else can I say? Music we've talked about. There's so many interesting stories about the filming that took place. We could go on and on, but why don't we take a look at at some of these slides. Jeffrey, you want to start us up with that first slide? Okay, so this very first slide, of course, is a slide. It's a zither, right? These are the strings of a zither, and we start to hear the music. This is even before the title card, right? And then the next slide, we're seeing, the title Vienna. We're, making sure the audience knows that this is really going to be a very big part of the story, is this location and what it looked like. And then in shot 3, this is where we first see our lead, Holly Barton. And of course, if you noticed, he walks under the ladder, which is of course an omen of bad luck. And that bad luck seems to haunt him, throughout the film. But it's just another example of unusual framing and some unusual, that's just a beautiful shot with the, close-up statues. And they certainly got their money's worth from these locations. But this is, and a slightly haphazard angle here too. This is not the way someone might normally shoot this scene. And then in slide 4, so here, look at this shot. We see him arriving at the apartment. He meets the porter there, Karl. And Karl, interesting, is played by a very famous Austrian actor named Paul Horberger. And Paul Horberger was very well known to the public in Austria. And they were more impressed by his involvement in the film than Joseph Cotten or Orson Welles or anybody else. The only problem was Horberger didn't speak any English. So he had to completely learn his part phonetically and just repeat it, for the camera. But this is where Holly first finds out that Harry Lime has been killed in an accident. And of course, in scene 5, this is when we first meet Anna Schmidt, played by Valli. And what an absolutely spectacular looking woman. And watching it this time, I was very drawn to her performance and recognizing, that because most people think of only, Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles and their relationship and their scenes, but I think she's absolutely fantastic in this film. And again, very curious to hear what other people thought as well. And then in slide 6, we now meet, Trevor Howard, as Major Calloway. Again, very unusual angle, very unusual lighting. Really, this is, film noir, at its greatest. And then so many interesting supporting characters and extras even. If you look at slide 7, this is also a very well-known Austrian actor named Ernst Deutsch. And what's sort of unusual is that there's a lot of attention, close-ups that are shot of these supporting characters and extras, which is a little unusual. That's not something you would normally find in a film that really, certainly a Hollywood film that often just focuses on the main stars. And then we have shot 7 with this incredible face with the little boy and his ball, right? And he's watching them arguing. And later on, of course, there's the whole complexion of, was Holly involved in Karl's murder or not? Number 9. Wow, look at that. Just amazing, And this is, of course, a shot where they're, they're going to be fleeing and chasing through the rubble streets of Vienna. And in fact, this whole idea of rubble streets and the way these locations in these cities in Berlin, that there became a whole genre of films that were, and I don't know the European word, but were called rubble films, because there were a whole bunch of films being made, not in English, but German films and Austrian films, that this became a whole, and even in Italy as well, that almost became a genre of itself, films that were low budget and shot in the rubble. Scene 12, what have we got? Scene 12. yeah, this is, you know, a discussion about Holly's pulp, you know, novels, and but it's just, again, very strange way to approach a three shot of characters, very strange angle. And again, you know, this brilliant cinematographer, Robert Krasker, shot 13. Yeah, this is Martin's in the shadows, walking the streets of Vienna, you know, no, I'm sorry, scene 12. Oh yeah, this is just, I'm sorry, scene 12 was the shot of the stairway. There we go. That's what I was thinking of. And look at the vanishing point, you know, disappearing, incredible shot. And then scene 13 is, yeah, is the great shot of him walking, soon to discover Harry Lime. He hears his voice, but a lot of nighttime shooting, of course, and incredible lighting. And then scene 14 is the beginning of, you know, perhaps one of the greatest reveals of any character in the history of cinema. We've heard everyone talking about Harry Lime for 30 minutes now or more. And we all believe he's dead. We're pretty sure he's dead. And then a light comes on to this nearby apartment in shot 15, and we see Orson Welles for the first time. And that smile, you know, it just says so much and so little. It's almost like you think of the Mona Lisa or something like that. And Welles just was the most charismatic, extraordinary actor. And of course, ultimately, you know, the perfect person for this film. And then in slide 16, this is when they're going to meet again at the Ferris wheel. And if you look at all the strings, and it almost looks like, you know, a zither, you know, it reminds you of the instrument of the zither itself. And of course, the Ferris wheel led to all of these famous shots. Number 17. Yeah, again, what a beautiful, intricate shot. Absolutely amazing. And, you know, again, it was all there for the photographer and the director to find, but they found it. And then, of course, in scene 18, this is the famous, we're getting to the famous cuckoo clock speech. So the cuckoo clock speech was actually improvised by Orson Welles. And he tells that famous story about, if you look at history and the Medicis and all the wonderful Renaissance things that happened, even though there was all the bloodshed with the Borgias, and then of course, Switzerland, very calm and very safe, and nothing too dramatic happens, and their greatest contribution is the cuckoo clock, which of course may or may not even be true, and which of course Orson Welles did not actually make up. This was actually a speech he had heard in a play many years before, but thought it would be very appropriate for that moment. And of course, it was such a great vocation and great opportunity to have a scene with, Cotten and Welles. And he added that speech, which, again, is part of the magic of the whole film. And then in scene 19, so this is the stakeout, right? Where we believe he's going to be approaching. We're waiting for Harry Lime. We think we're seeing him there. And of course, it just turns out to be the balloon salesman, right? What an incredible shot, though. And again, with the music and everything else, creates incredible intrigue and suspense. And I just wish we had been able to all watch it on the big screen to take advantage or really appreciate the quality of the shooting. Scene 20, we now get to the sewers, the famous sewers. And as I mentioned, Welles was not interested in going down into the sewers. He thought, the fumes were bad, or he made up all sorts of excuses. So often, in fact, the assistant director, Guy Hamilton, was actually the person who's being filmed in these shots, wearing, of course, Harry Lime's clothes. Guy Hamilton actually went on to become, a very famous director himself, directed some James Bond movies, etc. And then in scene 22, yeah, you know, I just think it's just amazing. Of course, this is the moment where, you know, Holly Martins is, you know, he is at, you know, in The Adversary, you know, Harry Lime, and they start to realize there's no way out, and this is going to be the end. And then in scene 22, in shot 22, well, you know, again, this is, of course, now we're on the set in London where the sewers were, you know, recreated. But this is sort of, you know, the desperation of Harry Lime as he knows the end is near. Scene 23, this is the famous shot of the fingers. I'm sure you remember this moment, you know, reaching his last gasp for freedom. He can't, you know, lower, you know, get the sewer cover open. And of course, that's the director's fingers, Carol Reed, not Orson Welles. But a very strange and abstract shot, very emotional shot. And then in 24, so of course, this is at the cemetery. And this is this amazing, you know, moment. The zither's playing, you know, we see, you know, Anna's character approaching. You know, most of the film is somewhat fast paced and very energetic. At this point, everything sort of slows down into these beautiful shots, which also, by the way, were not Dutch angles. They were done quite traditionally. And she continues right on walking. And we're all uncertain at the moment what will happen between the two of them. We know Holly has clearly fallen in love with her. And then, of course, shot 25, she's just walked right past him and walks beyond the camera lens. And we come to the end of the film. So thank you, Jeff. That was great. I hope that was helpful and reminded everybody of some of the wonderful moments in the film. Couple of comments about the release of the film. You know, in the British release, the narration is actually done by Carol Reed, the director. The version shown in American cinemas was actually, there was about 11 minutes of footage cut out. And Reed's voiceover was replaced by, of course, what you heard, which is Joseph Cotten as Holly Martin, you know, doing the narration. And sort of, it was cleaned up in certain ways for what Selznick thought the American audience would appreciate more. This is the famous Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, calls this one of his top 10 films. All of these reviews were incredibly positive, absolutely overwhelming. You know, comments about this doing Hitchcock proud, ingenious twists, atmospheric backgrounds, deft commingling of the sinister with the ludicrous, the casual with the bizarre. Another critic, you know, designed to excite and entertainment, brilliantly packaged the whole bag of cinema tricks, the whole range of inventive genius for making the camera expound, the gift for compressing a wealth of suggestion in a single shot, for building up agonized tension and popping surprises are all fully exercised. His devilishly mischievous humor also runs lightly through the film, touching the darker depression with light glints of the gay or macabre. What a review, huh? At the Academy Awards, Carol Reed was nominated for Best Director. It was also nominated for Best Cinematography, and Robert Krasker, of course, won. It was nominated as well for film editing. British Awards, Best Film, Best British Film, and then it also won the Cannes Film Festival's award for Best Film. So, you know, wonderful, wonderful things. Martin Scorsese, you know, often talks about this film as being an inspiration for his work. Anyhow, so many things we could go on and on about with these side characters, but I'd love to hear from you guys now and answer any questions or hear your comments or Anything that you think was of particular interest that maybe we haven't touched on so far?
Well, Alan Livingston is answering your question earlier, Fred, about the third man and the meaning of the title. He's wondering, is it a love triangle?
Um, no, I'm not sure this was a love triangle. Again, the relationship between Anna and Harry Lime is not completely, detailed. What we do understand, of course, is that in some way he rescued her, right? That she was a displaced person. She could have been very easily wound up, with the Russians who were awful. And we don't really know that much about her background, but he did save her. And clearly they were, having an affair. They were lovers. He was taking care of her. But whether that was a love relationship, I don't know. I think Harry Lime was a guy who he was in the world for himself. He was a smuggler. He was a criminal. He was taking advantage, as many others were, of the situation with the black market running rapid. Huge fortunes were being made. So whether it's a true love story, and Holly, obviously does fall in love with her. I'm not so sure she's really in love with him at all. She's entertained by him. She appreciates his attention, but I don't think this film is usually thought of as a love story.
Yeah, I don't believe there's any love there as well. I don't think that Anna's at all interested in Holly. Holly's a bit of a schmuck.
No, he writes Western dime store novels. He came over. He doesn't really know what's happening. He's not a bad guy.
No.
He's not certainly any great hero. And he's going to just, he gets caught up in this, fantastic situation and really doesn't know what to do.
I'm curious as to what Anna's story leading up to this period. If you think about, what was going on in Vienna and during the war, particularly with the Russian invasion. I mean, I'm sure there's a very
well. She wasn't Jewish. If she was Jewish, she would have been in a concentration camp. So
right.
somehow she did survive, and many Austrian, were able to survive the war and remain in Vienna. But what happened actually after the Germans left was almost worse, because when the Russians did invade, and they wound up in Berlin and Vienna, they were worse than the Germans were, in many ways to the civilians, and particularly to the women. Yeah. And the raping and pillaging was just rampant. And many young, beautiful women of that time only survived by participating or in some way, keeping alive by keeping these people at bay, and the sacrifices and things they had to do, we can't even imagine.
Yeah, terrible. Let's go to Brian Ross, who asks, what is the dramatic purpose of using Dutch angles, Fred?
Well, that's a good question. I think what it does, at least for me watching the film, is it truly draws your attention to the shot in such a way that you're sort of being asked the question, why? What is going on here that calls for this unusual representation of the image? And so it immediately embodies the shot with a sense of the unusual, be it, macabre, be it, just artistic, but it greatly enhances, I believe, the storytelling because of the attention and the focus. And it sort of involves you as a viewer, because you're not just watching it the way most films look. And you're watching it going, wow, that's different. What does that mean? So, many film directors are always looking for tricks to kind of involve the viewer and kind of pose questions or mysteries or situations where the viewer is starting to have to work themselves on understanding what's going on. So I don't think there's any one answer to, it's a great question, but I don't think there's any one answer to the question. I think it's done for different reasons and for different effect at different times. But, you know, again, this became a real staple of film noir. And this film, I think, perhaps more than any, you know, really exploited it to its maximum. And again, it's not just the Dutch angles, it's also the lighting and, you know, all of these different features combined.
A couple of questions from Margarita and also from Brian as well. Brian brings up the point that Vienna is referred to as a closed city. And Margarita has mentioned, was it common to have such empty streets at night? And just wondering if you know historically what was.
I don't know exactly. My assumption is there was a curfew. So in that respect, that would explain why the city was closed at night and was patrolled by these, you know, the various countries and there were borders between the different sections of the city. You just couldn't pass easily necessarily from the British, you know, section to the Russian section, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the idea of it being a closed city is that people were not allowed, you know, tourists that weren't coming to Vienna, you know, Berlin was the same, you know, this was a place that was under military control. It was occupied by, you know, a conquering army or armies. And it was a closed city and took many years to recover. Of course, ultimately they both did recover, but and there was enormous battling, of course, over the territory itself and who would ultimately retain control of these cities and eventually, of course, Austria did become an independent country again. And of course, in the case of Berlin, you know, with the airlift and Berlin being inside of Soviet territory, you know, it was a very complicated situation. But I think I don't really know too much more about it. Do you, Jeff? Or?
I'm a little bit, but I think we might get off on a different tangent
Okay.
here. But it's very much what you just mentioned, Fred. There was a lot of curfew directly after the war, and I think you've handled that one quite nicely. Just a couple of complimentary questions or points more than questions, but from David Striner, who we all know, David, this is your favorite movie. The Dutch angle when Holly is being driven to give his talk perfectly represents his anxiety because he didn't know where he was being driven. And it's kind of a comical scene, actually. And Jeffrey Eden mentioned the Dutch angle point. It's really to keep the audience off kilter and intrigued, which I think it does beautifully.
Yes, I think those are both great points and good examples, better than my explanation as to why and the power of the Dutch angles and the different ways it's used to create psychological tension, to keep the audience off kilter, to create a sense of suspense. You know, all those things are all come from the use of this interesting cinematographic technique.
Earlier, Alan Livingston mentioned, could you comment on the use of black and white and what is lost now with color?
Well, we could do a whole hour on that. You know, because forget black and white. How about the fact that we don't use film anymore? Everything is shot, you know, on digital, and there's no film. There's no photosynthesis process in exposing and creating these images, right? So black and white to me is really, well, actually, it really has to do with the evolution of film when you think about it. Because most art forms, you know, if you think about music or other things like that, often start in a very kind of realistic way, I would say. You know, and if you think of painting, they would, you know, copy things or, you know, landscapes, and then evolved into abstraction, you know, and modern art and music as well became more abstract over time. Film as an art form started completely abstract, right? It was black and white. That was the only technology they had that they could create images. There was no sound. It was all shot usually on sets, right? Or, you know, in a studio. And it was over time that suddenly things got added, like sound, like color, like going to locations to shoot. And if you really think about film as it evolved, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, particularly the 60s and 70s, it really became much more realistic as an art form than where it started, which was very abstract. Now, of course, because of the fact that it's all digital and the fact that, of course, we have this computer technology, we're back to the, very abstract recreation of photoreal things like in the Marvel superhero movies or Star Trek or any of those kinds of films. But I think it's very interesting. So I also think black and white, at least for me, creates a focus in terms of, it's the same thing with black and white photography versus color photography, if you want to compare the two. And there are many photographers who prefer to work in black and white, because what it does is really emphasizes the contrast, in the lighting of the situation, and colors not adding any kind of meaningfulness to the image. It's strictly the contrast of the various shades of gray. Of course, photography with color, you add all sorts of emotion. You think of some of the great Alfred Hitchcock movies, for example. There's so much color can add. But there are many directors who loved black and white and continued to use black and white even after color was available. If you think of The Apartment by Billy Wilder, that was 1960. He shot that film in black and white. And even recently, there have been films, shot in black and white. And one that I can think of particularly where it was done so effectively was Alfonso Cuarón's great movie,
Roma.
Roma. Amazing movie, all in black and white. So it often helps to create a sense of, I wouldn't say abstraction, but a world different than our normal world. And of course, there's this film. I mean, color was starting to be used around this period of time, but it was, of course, giant cameras and needed huge amount of light, and I'm sure it wasn't a consideration. But I think there's something that's been lost. A lot of people feel like film died when we added sound. The greatest films ever made were the silent films, because the director, the filmmaker, had nothing but a silent image to tell his story. And they were brilliant directors because they could tell you incredible stories and evoke enormous emotion and great performances with no sound at all, just with the power of image. And that it was only after you start introducing sound and all these other things that we've sort of lost something in terms of the power of the image to tell the story. And people get lazy and they don't give it the same attention as before. And this is something actually that is relevant to our next film series that we'll talk about in a moment at the end of the call.
A few more comments and questions, Fred. Linda Boswell asks, curious if the rebel streets and the subsequent rebel films actually took place in streets destructed by war, or if these were sets created for dramatic.
No, these were done in the real set. Particularly in Italy, there were a number of films that were shot in the rubble. Open City, of course, being one of the most famous. But again, Rossellini and Visconti, and there were films, shot in Germany at the time. I don't know, certainly not America, but I think in England, I'm not sure about whether there were rubble films or films that really emphasized the damage and destruction of London. But no, these were not sets. This was like this film, taking advantage of these absolutely extraordinary, locations and where did this exist? It was an incredible world. I mean, we can't even imagine, what it was like, the trauma of World War II and the trauma for the people who lived in these cities that were completely destroyed and bombed out and millions killed. And, I mean, we have COVID, but COVID is the silent killer. The technology all exists. These buildings all exist. It's just the people who are dying.
Deirdre Haskell mentioned, and this is an interesting comment, it's a moral tale. Anna and Holly were both rescued by Harry. For Anna, the personal loyalty is far more important than Harry's illegal and immoral activities. Holly betrays his friend, which is right.
That's right.
Thanks, Deirdre.
That's a great comment. I think it's absolutely true. And I think, again, it's very much a time of a reflection of the period. It's a reflection of what Graham Greene, as the novelist, was really interested in about human character. If you watch, or read some of his other books and movies, you'll see these same themes coming out again and again about what does it mean to be moral? What is an immoral act or not? And how dependent that is on the environment, the situation you're in, what's going on. This makes interesting drama, and he was perhaps one of the greatest, and in terms of really exploring this in such a way that he's not necessarily even giving us answers, and he's not necessarily condemning anybody in this film either. He's not, there's no good guy and bad guy per se. This is just, these are who these people are, and you have to accept them for who they are, and this is the way this story plays out.
Fred, I know I can answer this to Jeff Kaldma, who's asking, have either of you taken one of the Third Man movie walking tours in Vienna? I've not been to Vienna, unfortunately, Jeff. It's on my list, though. How about you, Fred?
Oh, I've not taken it, but you are correct. There are very famous walking tours of the Third Man walking tours, as there are, of other films and TV series, and Game of Thrones or whatever, or these kinds of things. And believe it or not, even though my family is from Vienna, my grandfather was born in Vienna. Fuchs, is how you would pronounce it. It means fox in German. And he emigrated when he was 6 years old. I've never been there. I've been many places in Europe, but not Vienna. I'm usually drawn more towards the Mediterranean, but I would love to go there, though I'm not sure what you would find that looks so much like it did then, but maybe the sewers. I guess the sewers are probably still there.
David Striner had also mentioned that the original Ferris wheel burned down, but an exact replica was built in the same place. So you can
that right? Yeah.
Some form or fashion of that Ferris wheel.
That's very iconic, and obviously, it's Vienna's become a huge tourist destination, and not necessarily just because of this movie, but
And Jeff, apparently the sewers are quite pleasant to visit. I was looking it up.
Well, the music, Vienna is one of the greatest music centers of the world, and many people I know go there just for music and for all the classical and the opera and all those kinds of things as well. So anyhow, look, we could go on. And of course, I'm sorry to have to be wrapping up this film noir series. There were many great film noir movies that we did not have a chance to talk about. And I hope if you become interested in this subject, you do watch them. Two I want to mention that are particular favorites of mine that we were not able to cover. And one of them is called Out of the Past. And it's from 1946. It was directed by a great director, Jacques Tourneur. Tourneur was a little like Edgar Ulmer, who directed Detour, brilliant director who never really did a lot of big A movies, but in his small, inexpensive film noir B movies did incredible things. And then another great one that you should watch is called The Killing, which was in 1956. And it's one of Stanley Kubrick's first films. Great director. And of course, Sterling Hayden. And that's a fantastic movie to see. By the way, one small trivia piece is that Carol Reed, after this film and kind of into the 50s, sort of fell off as a director. He was not, did not have as great a career as he did in the 40s. But he did come back, and I forget the year, and he directed a film called Oliver, the famous musical based on the play. And he won Best Director at the Academy Awards, finally that year for that film. And the director who he beat out was Stanley Kubrick, who had directed a little film called 2001, Space Odyssey. So if you could imagine the director of Oliver beat Stanley Kubrick in 2001, and it's some kind of sad commentary, I think, about the Academy Awards and how the Academy Awards are often awarded. But this leads us again to a segue to talk about the next film series, which we're calling And the Oscar Goes To. And you know, the Academy Awards season is coming, and it's going to be a very strange one because the awards themselves will be virtual. Obviously, a lot of great films weren't released. People are only watching them at home, etc. But we thought it'd be interesting to go back and look through the history of the Academy Awards and focus on some best pictures that maybe you folks are not as familiar with, that maybe have kind of lost their notoriety, or for whatever reason, might be of interest to watch again if you have seen them and discuss. So the first one that we're going to be talking about next week actually was came out in 1932, and it's called Grand Hotel. And Grand Hotel is one of the greatest studio films ever made. It was an MGM film, and it's the first film where they actually put 5 movie stars in the film. Normally, you know, they put 2 stars in. Nobody wanted to spend too much money, but MGM had great stars under contract, and the film stars Greta Garbo, John Barrymore, Lionel Barrymore, his brother, Joan Crawford, you know, very young Joan Crawford, and Wallace Beery, who was one of the biggest stars of the day. So if you haven't seen it, it's really remarkable and something to see. And it was hugely influential on cinema. Remember, they'd only started using sound like 2 or 3 years before that. The second film we're going to be showing is The Lost Weekend, which is a great film written and directed by Billy Wilder, starring Ray Milland. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1945. Then in the next one is Best Years of Our Lives, 1947. Is that right, Jeffrey? 48? Something like that. Dana Andrews. This was the great director William Wyler, one of my favorite directors, who I don't think we've really talked much about at all, but something that certainly deserved the Best Picture. And then moving a little closer to today, we're going to be showing you a film called In the Heat of the Night, which some people don't know won Best Picture. And in fact, for that film, Jeff is going to lead the talk. It was directed by the great Canadian director, Norman Jewison, probably Canada's greatest director. And I know it's a film that Jeff has loved and knows a lot about. So we're going to switch things up. And then we're going to finish in 1969 with the film Midnight Cowboy, the only X-rated movie to ever win a Best Picture. And if you don't know the film, it stars Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, and quite an extraordinary movie, and only could have been made in 1969, I think. I don't even know how you could release that movie today. But it did win Best Picture, which tells you something about what was going on, not just in Hollywood, but in the world in 1969. So please join us if you can. This has been a lot of fun. We're going to continue to do this. Right now, by the way, you know, we know Hamilton has moved to red. So what red means is we actually can have films at the theater, but we're limited to 10 people. So what we are open for is private screenings. So if you're interested in coming with 9 of your best friends down to the theater and watching a movie, you can rent the theater. Go to thewestdale.ca, or you can email Dan Fournier, dan@thewestdale.ca, and he can tell you a little bit more how these private rentals, you know, work. And then again, we're hoping, of course, to move to Orange. And once we move to Orange, then we're allowed to have 50 people at the cinema, and we can do things like we were doing last fall for a little while, where we may not be open, you know, 7 days a week and 3 showings a day, but we will have screenings and try to show some great curated films and whatever, you know, is available at the time. So hang in there. I know sometimes it's hard to believe this will ever end, but hopefully it will. And until it does, you know, I hope I see you again next Monday. And again, thank you for all your donations, all your support. You just can't imagine how meaningful that is for the Westdale and we're doing okay. We're still here, and we'll be here for many years to come. And thank you again, Jeff, for all your help with this series and the slides and being a great co-host. So
Really great series, Fred. Thanks for the talks, and thanks everybody for coming out.
see you all soon. Take care.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.